History books teach us that the Inquisition was a spiritual war fought by the Church against the devil. This is a lie. A forensic analysis of 13th century papal bulls reveals that Rome was not hunting a horned monster. They were hunting a specific, contagious idea. The Vatican didn't fear that people would worship Satan. They feared that people would realize they didn't need the Church to reach God. If you believe the official narrative, you remain a pawn in a game of control that has lasted 1,000 years. But if you are willing to look at the evidence, we are about to unlock a specific, blood-stained dossier from the Vatican secret archives regarding the Ignis Niger, the Black Flame. What we are about to reveal is not just forbidden history, it is the crime scene where the victim was your own potential for divinity. To understand the murder weapon, we must go back to the exact moment the smoke turned the sky black over France. The date is March 16, 1244. The location is the foothills of the Pyrenees, beneath the fortress of Montségur. The air is thick with the acrid stench of green wood, pitch, and the impending horror of burning flesh. We are witnessing the final brutal stroke of the Albigensian Crusade, a military campaign sanctioned by Pope Innocent III, not against Islam, but against a rival form of Christianity within Europe itself. At the base of the mountain, a massive pyre has been constructed, a palisade of stakes and straw designed for mass extermination. Over 200 men and women, known as the Perfecti, begin their descent from the castle. They are not chained. They are not dragged. In a display of conviction that terrified the crusading knights watching from the perimeter, these heretics walk willingly into the flames. This event is not merely a tragedy of medieval warfare. It is the forensic smoking gun of a forbidden history documentary. The Vatican did not mobilize an entire army and besiege a mountain fortress for 10 months simply to kill rebels. The archives suggest a far more desperate motive, the eradication of a specific, contagious metaphysical idea. The Cathars held no material treasure that justified this expense. Their wealth was doctrinal. They possessed a secret understanding of the Sol Niger alchemy, a belief that the true divinity was not the creator of the material world, but a spark trapped within it. To the casual observer, this looks like martyrdom. To the occult historian, it is evidence of a threat so profound that the Church deemed total annihilation the only remedy. The Perfecti believed that the fire of the material world, the fire of the pyre, was of the same substance as the demiurge, the false god of matter. By walking into it, they were not dying. They were engaged in a final act of separation, releasing the internal, divine spark from the prison of the flesh. This was Gnosticism explained. Through the ultimate sacrifice, they were demonstrating that the laws of the physical universe, including pain and death, held no dominion over the awakened spirit. The historical records, heavily redacted and curated by the victors, attempt to paint these people as devil worshippers. Yet, forensic analysis of the period's theology reveals that the Cathars viewed the Roman Church as the entity worshipping the god of this world, a deity of jealousy and wrath. The Cathars were the guardians of the left-hand path in its most primitive, ascetic form, the rejection of the collective law in favor of individual transcendence. They carried the oral tradition that the black flame was not evil, but the light of wisdom that the Orthodox sun sought to blind. This massacre at Montségur was intended to be the funeral pyre of that knowledge. The Church believed that by burning the bodies, they could incinerate the concept. It was a calculated attempt to cauterize the European mind, ensuring that the concept of an internal house uncreated God-self would never surface again. For centuries, it seemed to have worked. The Vatican secret archives locked away the interrogations, the manuscripts, and the truth of what the Perfecti whispered to each other before the smoke took them. However, ideas are not flammable. The physical destruction of the Cathar hierarchy only forced the tradition underground, where it began to mutate, merging with alchemical texts and Arabic mysticism. The silence that fell over Montségur was not an end, but an incubation period. The Black Flame was no longer a public heresy preached in the open fields of Languedoc. It became a whisper in the laboratories of the Renaissance, hidden behind complex ciphers and symbols to evade the Inquisition's eye. We have established the brutality of the suppression, the sheer scale of the fear that drove Rome to commit genocide. But to understand why this specific doctrine was considered more dangerous than any army or plague, we must look past the smoke of 1244. We must analyze the very language the inquisitors were trying to erase, tracing the terminology back to a time before the Church existed, to uncover the true meaning of the term that would later terrify the Western world. To conduct a proper forensic investigation into the forbidden history documentary of the Black Flame, we must first dismantle the linguistic traps set by centuries of theological dogma. The term itself, often translated in later grimoires as ignis niger, is not a reference to evil, but to physics and metaphysics. In the standard Orthodox dichotomy, light, lux, is associated with goodness, revelation, and God. However, in the ancient esoteric anatomy, visible light was often viewed with suspicion. Light reflects off surfaces. It creates illusions. It blinds the eye to what lies in the shadows. The black fire, or conversely, was not the absence of light, but the presence of absolute absorption, a heat that exists without the need for external fuel, symbolizing a self-sustained consciousness. Tracing the etymological roots requires us to look beyond the medieval Latin definitions and into the sands of pre-dynastic Egypt. Here, we encounter the archetype of Set, a deity often lazily categorized as a villain by modern Egyptologists, but who was originally the opener of ways and the god of distinct, isolated consciousness. The black flame, in this context, was the Bia separate from the Re. While Ra represented the collective solar order, the status quo of the universe, the Setian flame was the inner fire that allowed the individual to exist outside of that order. It was the metaphysical force of resistance that prevented the self from dissolving back into the cosmic soup. This concept migrates into Persian mysticism, specifically within the heterodox sects of Zoroastrianism. While the Orthodox priesthood worshipped the external fire as a symbol of Ahura Mazda, the hidden orders cultivated the concept of the black sun, or the midnight sun. This was not the star that warms the earth, but the psychic heat of the mind. Gnosticism explained, through this lens reveals a startling truth. The black flame is the intelligence that questions the creator. It is black because it is hidden, occultus, located in the deepest recess of the human psyche, invisible to the naked eye, yet capable of burning through the illusions of the material world. In the context of Sol Niger alchemy, the color black, nigrido, is the first and most crucial stage of the great work. It represents putrefaction, the breaking down of the ego and the social conditioning. Therefore, the black flame is the catalyst of this breakdown. It is the destructive force that burns away the false self to reveal the indestructible core. To the uninitiated, this process looks like death or madness, hence the fear. But to the adept, the blackness is the womb of the true self, a void of infinite potential that predates the "let there be light" of the Genesis narrative. The linguistic shift from black, meaning hidden, deep, to black, meaning evil, is a political fabrication of the later Roman Empire. Originally, the inner fire was seen as the spark of independence. It was the Promethean fire, stolen, yes, but stolen to liberate humanity from the cold ignorance of animal existence. The ancient philology suggests that ignis niger was synonymous with gnosis, a direct experiential knowledge that burns the vessel that holds it. It is a fire that does not comfort, it clarifies. The archives indicate that this distinction was well understood by the ancients. They did not fear the dark, they navigated it. The black flame was the torch used to explore the abyss of the self. It was an instrument of vision in a world blinded by the glaring light of dogmatic obedience. The terminology only becomes sinister when viewed through the lens of a control structure that demands total submission to an external power. However, before this definition was twisted into a synonym for Satanism, it was the cornerstone of the most prestigious spiritual institutions of the ancient world. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must travel back before the rise of Rome, to the mystery schools where this dark fire was not persecuted but actively cultivated as the highest pinnacle of human evolution. Before the Vatican secret archives were established to curate the narrative of Western civilization, the concept of the black flame existed in a state of reverence, untainted by moral panic. In the hushed corridors of the Orphic and Hermetic mystery schools, the inner fire was not viewed as a demonic infection, but as the crowning jewel of the human condition. This was the era before the Great Inversion, where the pursuit of gnosis, direct knowledge, was the defining characteristic of the spiritual elite. The initiates of these schools understood that while the physical body was a product of nature, bound by the cycles of rot and decay, the intellect was fueled by a different source. They called it the pneuma, or the divine spark, a fragment of a hypercosmic reality that had no business existing in a world of mud and blood. The archetypal representation of this era is found in the myth of Prometheus. In the eyes of the Forbidden History documentary lens, Prometheus is the original Luciferian figure, but without the Christian baggage of evil. He stole fire from the Olympian gods, the ruling cosmic order, and gifted it to humanity. This fire was not merely heat, it was technion nous mind. It was the capacity for abstract thought, the ability to defy the environment, and the will to reshape reality. In this pre-corruption context, the black flame gas was celebrated as the gift of Set in the Typhonian tradition, an isolate intelligence that separates the conscious individual from the sleeping collective of the animal kingdom. To the ancient philosophers, the natural world was a deterministic machine. Animals are slaves to instinct. They eat, sleep, and breed according to a program they cannot rewrite. The black flame was the glitch in that program. It was the evolutionary anomaly that allowed a distinct I to emerge from the herd. This was the essence of the left-hand path long before the term existed, the deliberate cultivation of the self against the crushing weight of the natural order. It was understood that this flame required fuel, discipline, study, and ordeal to prevent it from flickering out and returning the soul to a state of sleep. The rituals of this period were designed to fan this flame. In the subterranean chambers of the Mithraic cults, initiates underwent symbolic deaths to sever their attachment to the material world, not to escape it, but to master it. The Sol Niger alchemy of the soul began here, the realization that the true king was not the sun in the sky, but the hidden sun within the chest. To possess this flame was to accept the burden of godhood. It meant that you were no longer a child of the gods, begging for scraps of favor, but a sibling to them, capable of challenging their decrees. This Promethean ambition was the engine of ancient progress. It drove the construction of the pyramids, the decoding of the stars key, and the development of mathematics. It was a spirituality of empowerment, where the inner fire was the trusted guide through the darkness of ignorance. There was no concept of sin attached to knowledge. The only sin was unconsciousness. The black flame was the beacon of the awakened will, a sign of spiritual maturity that commanded respect rather than fear. However, this democratization of divinity posed a fatal problem for the emerging structures of centralized power. A society of self-directed gods is impossible to govern. If every individual possesses the divine fire and the capacity for direct revelation, the need for a mediating priesthood evaporates. The mediator requires a dependent flock, not a gathering of lions. The existence of the black flame threatened the very foundation of the hierarchical control system that was about to descend upon Europe. The transition from reverence to heresy was not accidental. It was a calculated geopolitical maneuver. The architects of the new religious order realized that to rule the world, they first had to extinguish the light within the individual. They needed to create a narrative where the internal fire was not a gift, but a curse. And to do that, they needed a villain, a crusade, and a specific moment in history to declare war on the human spirit itself. The turning point in the history of human consciousness can be carbon dated to the early 13th century. This is the moment. The Forbidden History documentary narrative shifts from ancient wisdom to active, militarized suppression. The protagonist of this dark chapter is Pope Innocent III, a man who viewed the papacy not merely as a spiritual office, but as the supreme authority over the temporal world. His declaration of the Albigensian Crusade marked the first time a pope sanctioned a holy war against Christians within Europe's borders. The violence was the symptom. The disease they were trying to cure was the widespread belief in personal gnosis. The Church faced an existential crisis. If the divine spark resides within the individual, and if salvation is achieved through the internal kindling of this black flame, then the vast, opulent machinery of the Vatican is rendered obsolete. The suppression was not a matter of theology, it was a matter of economics and power. The priesthood relies on the axiom that the gap between God and man is infinite and unbridgeable, save for the toll bridge operated by the Church. The Gnostic sects, particularly the Cathars and the lingering Hermetic orders, threatened to dismantle this toll bridge. They taught that the left-hand path, the path of self-reliance, was the only true way to divinity. By declaring that the kingdom of heaven is within, they were effectively dismantling the need for cathedrals, tithes, and cardinals. The suppression was an act of corporate survival. The Vatican's secret archives contain the papal bulls from this era, documents that drip with legalistic venom, redefining the search for internal truth as the ultimate crime against the cosmic order. This era birthed the Inquisition, a bureaucracy designed to police the imagination. Unlike civil courts that judged actions, the Inquisition judged thoughts. They hunted for the ignis niger in the minds of the populace. The interrogation manuals of the time reveal a distinct obsession with the pride of the heretic, specifically, the pride of believing one could know God without a priest. The suppression was systematic. Books were burned, not because they contained lies, but because they contained the dangerous truth of soul niger alchemy, that the human soul is not a servant, but a slumbering sovereign. The strategy was total information control. By physically exterminating the carriers of this oral tradition, the Church created a vacuum of knowledge. In this vacuum, they inserted a new narrative, that any spiritual impulse not sanctioned by Rome was, by definition, demonic. The inner light was retconned as a deceptive lure of the devil. The autonomy of the self was framed as the sin of rebellion. Gnosticism, explained by the victors, became a tale of arrogant men trying to usurp the throne of God, rather than lost souls trying to find their way home. This was the great theft of the Middle Ages. The institutional church effectively claimed a monopoly on divinity. They externalized the Holy Chow, placing it high above the clouds, accessible only through submission, while the internal world of the human being was declared a zone of depravity and original sin. The black flame, once the symbol of the highest intelligence, was buried under layers of fear and dogma. The archives show a deliberate effort to equate the hidden with the evil, ensuring that future generations would be terrified to look inside themselves. The success of this suppression was terrifyingly complete. For centuries, the Western mind was conditioned to look outward for salvation. Terrified of the dark recesses of its own psyche, the divine spark was extinguished from public discourse, replaced by the doctrine of total depravity. But a political victory is rarely a spiritual one. You can burn the heretic, but the archetype remains in the collective unconscious, waiting for a trigger to resurface. However, legal decrees and public burnings were not enough to permanently kill an idea as potent as self-deification. To ensure the black flame would never again threaten the hierarchy, the Church needed to do more than ban it. They needed to fundamentally alter the mythology of the West. They needed to take the bringer of this flame and transform him into the ultimate monster. The suppression of the black flame required a psychological operation of unprecedented scale, a campaign that the forbidden history documentary genre identifies as the greatest PR smear in human history. The Church realized that simply banning the inner light was insufficient. They had to make it repulsive. This necessitated the strategic inversion of the archetype of the light bearer. In the ancient world, the figure who brought illumination, Lucifer, from the Latin lux, light, and fere, to bring, was a symbol of the dawn, of intellect, and of awakening. The medieval theologians, working within the framework of the Vatican secret archives, deliberately conflated this Promethean figure with Satan, the Hebrew term for adversary. This conflation was not scripturally accurate, but it was politically brilliant. By equating the bringer of light key with the prince of darkness, they successfully branded the pursuit of knowledge as an act of ultimate evil. This transformation weaponized the concept of pride. In the context of Gnosticism explained, pride was not vanity, it was the recognition of one's own divine origin. The Gnostics believed that the human spirit was equal to, or arguably superior to, the creator of the material world. To the Church, this was the ultimate heresy. The theological machinery re-engineered the definition of virtue to mean submission and the definition of sin to mean independence. Therefore, the black flame, the fuel of independence, became the signifier of the fallen. To possess it was no longer a mark of the elect, but the mark of the damned. The demonization process extended into folklore and law through the invention of the witch's mark. Inquisitors claimed that those in league with the devil bore a physical insensitivity or a blemish on their skin. This was a crude, material distortion of the esoteric concept of the mark of Cain, or the inner mark of the left-hand path. The original tradition held that the black flame marked the soul, distinguishing it from the collective. The Church materialized this metaphor, turning a spiritual distinction into a physical deformity that could be poked with needles in a courtroom. It was a tactic to drag the metaphysical down into the mud, stripping it of its dignity and making it a matter of gross superstition. Simultaneously, the narrative of the Garden of Eden was solidified as a warning against Sol Niger alchemy. The serpent offering the fruit of the tree of knowledge was interpreted as the first dealer of the black flame. The promise, "Ye shall become as gods," was framed as the original lie. However, a forensic reading of the text suggests the serpent told the truth. They did gain knowledge of good and evil. The Church's stance was that humanity was not meant to have this fire, that we were designed as pets in a garden, not gods in the wilderness. The demonization of the serpent was effectively the demonization of the critical intellect. This era effectively severed the link between the Western mind and its own potential for self-deification. The shadow self, which should have been integrated and understood, was projected outward as the devil. This caused a psychic split in the European population, a collective neurosis where men and women were terrified of their own thoughts. Viewing any deviation from orthodox dogma as a whisper from Satan, the black flame was pushed into the deepest dungeons of the subconscious, where it began to fester, no longer a light of wisdom, but a fire of repressed rage. Yet, the esoteric current is like water. Block it here and it flows there. While the priests terrified the peasantry with tales of horned beasts, the intellectuals and alchemists retreated into the world of symbols. They realized that writing "I am God" would lead to the stake, but drawing a picture of a black sun rotting in the earth could be passed off as a chemical diagram. The demonization forced the tradition to evolve from spoken word to visual code. The knowledge of the black flame did not vanish. It went into camouflage. It was encoded into the intricate, bizarre, and terrifying illustrations of the medieval grimoires, books that are technically manuals of chemistry, but are functionally maps of the soul. To find the truth now, we must stop reading the words and start decoding the nightmares painted on the vellum. To the untrained eye, the illuminated manuscripts of the Renaissance, such as the Splendor Solis or the Rosarium Philosophorum, appear to be primitive attempts at chemistry or bizarre fever dreams of madness. However, a forensic analysis through the lens of a forbidden history documentary reveals that these are not books of science, but military-grade encryption keys for the soul. When the Inquisition made it fatal to speak of the inner light, the masters of the tradition hid the doctrine of the black flame inside the illustrations themselves. These images were designed to bypass the censorship of the logical mind and the watchful eye of the Church, communicating directly with the unconscious. The most potent of these symbols is the Sol Niger, the black sun. In the 22nd plate of the Splendor Solis, we see a sun that does not shine. It is a black, rotting orb sinking into the earth, often surrounded by a landscape of desolation. To the literalist censors of the Vatican secret archives, this depicted the putrefaction of organic matter in a flask. But Gnosticism explained. Through visual codes tells a different story. The black sun represents the ego in a state of total collapse. It is the necessary destruction of the social persona. The alchemists understood that before the black flame core could be ignited, the false light of the daytime self, the part of you that obeys laws, pays taxes, and fears God, had to be extinguished. The recurring motif of the crow or raven standing upon a white skull is another image that has been grossly exploring by Hollywood as mere necromancy. In the context of Sol Niger alchemy, the crow is the bird of the nigredo phase. It symbolizes the withdrawal of the senses. When the alchemist enters the blackness, they are cutting off the input from the outside world. The skull is not a symbol of physical death, but of the stripped-down mind, the bare architecture of consciousness without the flesh of vanity. This was a visual instruction. To find the light, you must first enter the tomb of your own mind. We also see frequent depictions of a king or a hermaphrodite being washed in a black bath or consumed by a wolf. These are violent, disturbing images intended to shock the viewer. This shock value was functional. It served to wake up the observer, shaking them out of their dogmatic slumber. The black flame requires friction to ignite. The left-hand path has always utilized transgressive imagery not to worship evil, but to shatter the cultural conditioning that keeps the human spirit docile. The grimoires were effectively psychological obstacle courses designed to weed out the fearful. It is a testament to the cleverness of these occultists that these books survived at all. The Church burned the Cathars for speaking plainly, but they preserved the alchemical texts in their own libraries, believing them to be harmless curiosity. They failed to realize that the philosopher's stone described in these texts was not a rock that turns lead into gold, but the crystallized black flame itself, the indestructible psyche that survives the death of the body. The gold they sought was spiritual sovereignty, hidden under the jargon of metallurgy. This visual language created a silent circle of initiates who could recognize each other across borders without ever speaking a word of heresy. If you understood why the sun was black, you were part of the brotherhood of the Ignis Niger. You understood that the darkness was not empty. It was pregnant with potential. The illustrations were static maps of a dynamic, terrifying internal territory that few dared to traverse. However, staring at a map is not the same as walking the terrain. The symbols of the black sun and the crow were merely the theory. To actually ignite the flame, to separate the self from the universal collective, required more than contemplation. It required a specific, dangerous set of actions that moved beyond the page and into the realm of forbidden practice. Moving from the encoded pages of the grimoires to the practical application of the left-hand path, we encounter the most misunderstood aspect of the forbidden history documentary, the ritual mechanics of the black flame. The popular imagination, fed by centuries of propaganda, envisions hooded figures chanting in Latin to summon demons for material wealth. This is a gross oversimplification of a sophisticated, if dangerous, psychological technology. The core mechanic of these rituals is not worship, but antinomianism, a Greek term meaning against the law. In the context of the Vatican secret archives, this was heresy. In the context of the practitioner, it was a necessary shock to the system to induce a state of hyper-individuation. The mechanics operate on a principle diametrically opposed to the right-hand path. Orthodox religions seek to dissolve the ego, to merge the drop of water back into the ocean of God. The left-hand path seeks to harden the drop so it can survive the ocean without dissolving. To ignite the black flame is to reinforce the isolate intelligence against the crushing weight of the universal mind. The universe naturally leans toward entropy and unity. The practitioner uses ritual to create order and separation. This is an unnatural act, requiring a tremendous exertion of will to maintain the structural integrity of the self against the cosmic current. Historically, this was achieved through the deliberate shattering of cultural taboos. The Agori in India, the Tantric Kaula circles, and the Western followers of the Typhonian tradition utilized rituals that involved interacting with the impure, death, decay, and forbidden fluids. This was not done for shock value or perversion, as the Church claimed. It was a form of deconditioning. Social norms are the software running on the human biocomputer. By consciously breaking the most deeply held taboos, while maintaining perfect mental focus, the adept crashes the social programming. In that moment of cognitive dissonance, the black flame flares up. The raw, unconditioned observer behind the eyes is revealed. This process is technically known as the ordeal of the abyss. It is a controlled psychosis. The ritual creates a boundary where the practitioner steps outside the protection of the collective moral law. In this lawless space, there is no God to protect you, no society to validate you. You are entirely alone with the void. If the practitioner is weak, the void devours them. This is the source of the madness often associated with occultists. But if the practitioner is strong, the friction of the ordeal ignites the internal fire. They realize that they exist independently of the external universe. Sol Niger alchemy describes this as the separation of the volatile from the fixed, The ritual burns away the volatile personality, the part of you that worries what the neighbors think, to reveal the fixed spirit, the black flame. The magic here is not about shooting fireballs. It is about rewriting the neural pathways to operate on a frequency of absolute autonomy. It is the difference between a domesticated dog and a wolf. The ritual is the process of undomestication. The danger of these mechanics cannot be overstated. They are designed to sever the cords that bind the individual to humanity. The successful adept becomes something another, a solitary star in a dark sky. The Gnosticism explained in these rites is cold and unforgiving. It offers power, yes, but the price is isolation. The warmth of the herd is traded for the chill of the void. However, because these internal psychological earthquakes have no visible symptoms other than a change in demeanor, the outside world had to invent a narrative to explain the power of these individuals. The peasant and the priest could not see the internal black flame, so they invented an external one, a myth of green fire and magical blasts that would haunt the public imagination for centuries. If you search for the black flame in the lexicon of modern pop culture, you will likely find a candle in a Disney movie or a special effect in a video game. Hollywood has effectively lobotomized the concept, reducing a terrifying metaphysical anomaly to a plot device for teenage witches. In movies like Hocus Pocus, the black flame is merely a magical trigger, a greenish fire that resurrects the dead or grants external power. This trivialization is not accidental. It is a cultural safety mechanism. By turning the Ignis Niger into a cartoon trope or a CGI weapon, society protects itself from the gravity of what the concept actually implies. It allows the audience to consume the aesthetic of the left-hand path without ever touching the live wire of its philosophy. A forensic examination of the Forbidden History documentary record, specifically within the Typhonian tradition and the genuine left-hand path currents, reveals a reality that is starkly devoid of special effects. There are no fireballs. There are no lightning strikes. The black flame is not a weapon you throw at your enemies. It is a weapon you turn upon yourself. The reality of the practice is an excruciating psychological ordeal of isolation. While the movies depict the witch gaining power over the town, the historical texts depict the practitioner losing their connection to humanity. The power gained is not material wealth or telekinesis, but a radical form of self-possession that often looks like madness to the outside observer. The greatest lie propagated by fiction is that this path is about material gain. The grimoires of Sol Niger alchemy make it clear. The black flame burns up the desire for the material world. It does not give you the ability to control the elements. It gives you the ability to ignore them. The magician of history was not a wizard in a tower commanding armies. He was often an ascetic, living on the fringes of society, wrestling with the crushing weight of a consciousness that refused to submit to the collective dream. The black flame is the burden of absolute responsibility. It is the realization that there is no God coming to save you, and that you are the sole architect of your heaven or hell. This reality is far more terrifying than any horror movie monster. A monster can be killed. The burden of self-deification cannot be escaped. The practitioners who failed to contain this fire did not explode. They suffered psychic fragmentation. They collapsed under the pressure of trying to be a god in a monkey's body. The archives are littered with the names of occultists who ended their lives in asylums, not because they summoned a demon, but because they dismantled their own egos without a strong enough foundation to replace it. Therefore, the black flame is not magic in the theatrical sense. It is a specific orientation of the will. It is a silent, invisible force that opposes the natural order of entropy. It is the no spoken against the universe's demand for submission. While Hollywood sells the fantasy of external power, the true tradition whispers about the horror of internal freedom. But as the age of faith collapsed and the age of reason took hold, this terrifying concept did not vanish. It merely shed its alchemical skin. The black flame was adopted by a new priesthood, the men of science and psychology, who gave it new names, stripped of medieval superstition but retaining all of its dangerous potency. In the sterile, white-tiled rooms of early 20th century psychiatric clinics, the black flame underwent its most significant transformation since the Middle Ages. The Forbidden History documentary narrative here shifts from the burning stake to the analyst's couch. As the power of the Vatican's secret archives waned in the face of the Enlightenment, the ancient alchemical language was translated into the new vernacular of psychology. The central figure in this resurrection was Carl Gustav Jung. While publicly a scientist, Jung was privately a Gnostic revivalist. His Red Book, a text kept hidden for decades, is essentially a modern grimoire, filled with images that mirror the Sol Niger alchemy of the medieval era. Jung realized that the demons the Church fought were actually autonomous complexes within the psyche, and the black flame was not a tool of Satan, but the engine of individuation. Individuation is the clinical term for the left-hand path. It is the process of peeling away the de-persona, the mask worn for society, to confront the shadow. In Jungian analysis, the shadow contains all the repressed power, aggression, and creativity that the civilized mind rejects. To ignite the black flame in a modern context is to integrate this shadow. It is the realization that the I is not the polite citizen, but a dangerous, multifaceted entity capable of both great creation and destruction. Jung warned that this process was not safe. To look into the black sun of the unconscious is to risk being swallowed by it. This mirrors the ancient warning of the abyss exactly, stripped of its religious terminology, but retaining its psychic hazard. Parallel to this psychological excavation was the philosophical earthquake, triggered by Friedrich Nietzsche. When he declared, "God is dead," he was effectively announcing the extinguishing of the external sun, the objective moral order of the Church. But he did not leave humanity in the dark. He proposed the Übermensch als Overman as the new source of light. This concept is pure Gnosticism explained for a secular age. The Übermensch is the individual who has ignited the black flame of the will to power, creating their own values in a meaningless universe. Nietzsche's eventual madness is often cited by occult historians not as a disease, but as a circuit blowout, a failure to contain the voltage of the internal fire he succeeded in kindling. We can even trace this archetype into the cold, hard math of modern cosmology. Physicists tell us that the universe is governed by two opposing forces: gravity, which pulls things together, and dark energy, which pushes them apart. Gravity is the force of the collective, the binding agent of the one. Dark energy, which constitutes the majority of the universe, is the force of expansion, isolation, and separation. The Mont Blanc flame is the psychic equivalent of dark energy. It is the force that resists the gravitational pull of the collective unconscious, pushing the individual mind away from the one and out into the infinite void of self-definition. This scientific parallel reinforces the ancient Typhonian view that the left-hand path is antinatural or contra naturam. Nature seeks equilibrium, entropy, and the dissolution of boundaries. The black flame is negentropy. It is the stubborn refusal to dissolve. It is an anomalous energy that burns against the current of the universe. To carry this flame is to be in a constant state of metaphysical war with the environment around you. It explains the profound alienation felt by those who pursue this path. They are literally fighting the laws of physics on a spiritual level. The modern era did not kill the black flame. It weaponized it. We see its flicker in the obsession with self-actualization, in the rebellion against institutional authority, and in the transhumanist desire to overcome biological limits. The alchemist's laboratory has become the biohacker's garage and the psychologist's office. The tools have changed, from wands to willpower, from lead to neurons, but the goal remains the same: the creation of a god out of a man. We have traced the fire from the pyres of Montségur to the inkblots of the asylum. We have seen it suppressed, demonized, encoded, and analyzed. But after stripping away the history, the psychology, and the myth, we are left with the raw, radioactive core of the matter. We must now confront the final, terrifying implication of what it actually means to possess this fire, a conclusion that the Vatican tried to bury not out of hate, but perhaps out of mercy. We arrive at the final, jagged edge of our investigation. The Forbidden History documentary trail ends not with a revelation of joy, but with a realization of horror. The black flame is not a prize, it is a sentence. The ultimate secret buried in the Vatican's secret archives is not that God doesn't exist, but that the position is vacant, and the only candidate to fill it is you. This is the terrifying implication of absolute freedom that the Church fought so desperately to suppress. If the inner fire is real, then there is no external savior coming to rescue us. There is no benevolent father figure in the clouds waiting to wipe away the tears. There is only the self, burning in the void, solely responsible for its own salvation or damnation. Perhaps, in a twisted irony, the Inquisition was an act of mercy. The Grand Inquisitors understood a fundamental truth about human psychology that Gnosticism explained often overlooks. The vast majority of humanity does not want freedom. They want security. They want a shepherd. To tell a peasant or a modern office worker that they are a sleeping god capable of warping reality is to place a crushing weight upon their shoulders. It is the weight of total accountability. If you are the creator of your reality, you have no one to blame for your suffering. You cannot pray for help, because the only one listening is the part of you that you haven't accessed yet. This is the Gnostic conclusion. The left-hand path is not for the many, it is for the few who can endure the cold. The black flame requires the fuel of the ego, consuming the comfort of belonging to the herd. To kindle it is to accept that you are an orphan in the universe. The Sol Niger alchemy was never about turning lead into gold. It was about turning a dependent child into an independent sovereign. The Church protected the masses from this psychological vertigo, offering them the warm blanket of dogma and the promise that if they just obeyed, everything would be taken care of. The black flame strips away that blanket. It reveals the universe as a chaotic, indifferent place where the only order is the order you impose upon it. This is why the symbol is so often linked to the adversary, to the collective. The individual who needs no master is the ultimate threat. They are unpredictable, ungovernable, and dangerous. The black flame is the spark of chaos that refuses to conform to the structure of the hive. Therefore, the suppression was successful, not because the Church was strong, but because the truth was too heavy for the average soul to carry. The secret was hidden in plain sight, protected by our own fear of being truly alone. We demonized the inner light because it was easier to fear the devil than to face the God in the mirror. As we close this dossier, the question shifts from history to the viewer. The ancient texts, the burned heretics, and the coded grimoires all point to one singular, uncomfortable interrogation. You have spent this time learning about the fire that the Vatican tried to extinguish, but knowledge is not passive, it is contagious. Now that you know what the black flame is, you must decide what to do with the spark. Are you the moth, endlessly circling the external lights of society, religion, and validation, hoping for warmth? Or are you the fire itself, dark, consuming, and alone, burning with a light that no wind can extinguish? The archives are open. The choice is yours. The fires of Montségur have long since burned out, but the ash remains lodged in the collective unconscious of the West. We have peeled back the layers of suppression to reveal a terrifying truth. The institutions of power did not bury the black flame to protect God. They buried it to protect their monopoly on your soul. A humanity that realizes its own divinity cannot be ruled, tithed, or controlled. You have now seen the evidence. The cage is visible. The lock is psychological. The key lies in the very darkness you have been conditioned to fear. The investigation requires you to make a choice. Do you return to the safety of the herd, grazing in the light of a false sun, or do you dare to step into the shadow and ignite the fire that burns without fuel? The abyss is waiting. Subscribe to the channel and let us descend further into the dark together.